The first sign came in the spring. We'd had a light drizzle the night before, just enough to dampen the grass and leave the scent of wet soil hanging in the air. As I stepped out to retrieve my mail, I noticed a subtle depression in the community park's southwest corner, a soft basin where water collected into a mirrored pool, refusing to drain even hours after the rain stopped. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it, but I'm not most people. I spent 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. I've seen Afghan deserts flash flood in under an hour. I've watched stormwater turn forward operating bases into swamp pits. I know what it looks like when soil starts to lose its integrity and what happens when people ignore it. That basin, it wasn't just water pooling. It was the land beginning to sink. I walked the perimeter with my measuring wheel that same afternoon, took soil samples near the playground fence and the walking path, logged the saturation levels in my notebook. I even tossed a golf ball across the grass and watched as it gently rolled toward the sagging center drawn by gravity, like a marble in a bowl. This wasn't just a natural dip in the land. It was a collapse waiting to happen. The next day, I attended our monthly HOA meeting in the clubhouse. As usual, the folding chairs were half filled, mostly with the same familiar faces, retirees. A couple of moms juggling toddlers, and the ever-vigilant board president, Karen Whitmore. Karen had a smile like polished granite and a tone that could slice steel. She opened the meeting talking about upgrades, installing decorative pavers in the park, new benches, and plans for a yoga deck near the duck pond. Then she opened the floor. I stood up, notebook in hand. "Ma'am, I need 5 minutes of your attention. There is an issue with soil subsidence near the park's western edge. I believe the underground drainage has collapsed or clogged. It's collecting water, and if we don't address it now, it's going to get worse fast." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Bellamy, is this the same concern you brought up last month about the retaining wall shift?" "Yes," I replied. "And this is related. I've charted 3 new sink spots in the last 6 weeks. We're on low-lying land, and the runoff has nowhere to go since the last landscaping change. That French drain you covered last year, it's part of the problem." From the back, someone chuckled. Karen didn't laugh, but she smirked. "Are you suggesting our upgrades are making the neighborhood unsafe?" "I'm suggesting we do a proper survey before adding more impermeable surfaces," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Concrete doesn't absorb water. And your proposal to pave the park will beautify the space and increase property values," she cut in. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. We appreciate your service and enthusiasm." Enthusiasm. I could feel the room slipping into that polite, dismissive glaze they always reserved for the guy with too many maps and too much history. I sat down. But I didn't let it go. That week, I emailed the board a full report, photos, elevation maps, videos of the pooling. I referenced county floodplain records included before and after drone footage, and suggested a temporary dry well to test for subsurface water pressure. 3 days later, the email bounced back. Their address had changed. No forwarding notice. I printed a hard copy and slid it under the clubhouse office door. I didn't hear back, but I kept watching. By mid-May, the depression had grown. You couldn't tell from eye level, but my drone showed the grass darkening in a tight oval pattern, water lingering longer with each rain. I knocked on Karen's door one evening with side-by-side satellite images from 6 months apart. She opened, looked down at the papers, and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Bellamy, I think you're seeing ghosts." I looked her square in the eye. "No, ma'am. I've seen ghosts. This is something else entirely. This is negligence." She shut the door. From that day forward, I became that guy in the neighborhood. The one who walked around with a clipboard and a laser level. Kids laughed. A few neighbors nodded awkwardly as they passed me. One man, Todd from Unit 6B, muttered something about me retiring too hard. But I knew what I saw. And I remembered what it cost to ignore warning signs. In Mosul, we lost an entire mobile field unit because an irrigation trench overflowed during the night. Water has no mercy. It follows gravity. It seeks the lowest place and fills it like a coffin. And I had a sinking feeling we were building one here. They didn't just ignore me, they laughed. The next HOA meeting came a month later. By then, I had documented 10 more incidents of poor drainage. One homeowner on Cedar Lane, Miss Janice, told me her backyard stayed soggy for days, even when there hadn't been recent rain. Another resident said his fence posts had started to tilt slightly inward, a classic sign of ground shift due to water retention. I compiled their testimonies with my updated drone photos and came to the clubhouse with a full-color binder, clearly tabbed and indexed. I stood up during the open session, held the binder like it was my last flare in a dark canyon, and said, "This is real. We need to test the subsurface drainage before summer storm season." Karen didn't even glance at the binder. She leaned into her microphone and said, "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy, for your continued concern. But the engineering firm we consulted during the park expansion project assured us the soil is stable. We believe the occasional pooling is normal and not cause for alarm." "Engineering firm?" I asked. Which one? I checked the HOA budget line items. "There's no allocation for a soil test or site survey." That's when Daniel Thompson, the vice president, mid-30s smug, always in a polo shirt, leaned back and chuckled. "Are you accusing the board of lying, Mr. Bellamy? Because if you are, we can take this to the HOA Compliance Committee." "I'm asking for accountability," I said, voice steady. "And maybe a little common sense." Karen smiled again, the same thin-lipped, polished smile. "Paranoia doesn't look good on a man of your experience." A ripple of laughter followed, the kind that's half uncomfortable, half condescending. They weren't even hiding their disdain anymore. I sat down, heart pounding. It wasn't the mockery that stung the most, it was the betrayal. This was my community. I'd moved here to find peace after retiring. I'd bought the house, not for its price or size, but because of the park across the street. The trees, the promise of calm. Instead, I was treated like a relic, someone to be humored, then discarded. The worst part, some of the residents I'd tried to help started pulling back. One woman who'd previously told me about water in her crawl space now avoided eye contact at the mailbox. A dad I'd once helped change a flat tire crossed the street when he saw me coming. Karen's influence was spreading like rot through dry timber. The next day, I found out they'd made it official. A notice appeared on my front door, an HOA warning. Unapproved alterations to front property drainage systems. I stood there, staring at it. The gravel swale I'd added to my yard, designed to channel water away from the foundation, was now considered a violation. Never mind that it wasn't visible from the street. Never mind that it worked. They were retaliating. I went inside and poured myself a glass of cold water. Sat down. Took a breath. This wasn't my first rodeo. In Kandahar, I once had to rebuild a collapsed well system while insurgents watched from the tree line. I'd faced worse than an angry homeowner's board. But still it hurt. I spent the next week revisiting every home on the lower half of the neighborhood. I walked door to door with a clipboard offering free visual inspections for drainage issues. I didn't charge. I didn't even ask for signatures. I just wanted people to know what they were walking into. Out of the 23 homes I visited, 12 had noticeable drainage problems, standing water-clogged runoff zones, shallow grading, or signs of erosion. When I returned to the clubhouse with the results, I wasn't allowed to speak. Karen had changed the meeting format. Open comment period was canceled to maintain efficiency. So I left the report on the front table. The next morning, I found it torn in half and stuffed into my mailbox. No envelope, no note, just a clean rip right down the middle. A message. The gloves were off. For the next few weeks, I felt the cold shoulder grow. People stopped waving. My gardening supplies were stolen from behind my shed. At night, I'd hear the sound of tires screeching near my driveway, then fading quickly down the road. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Instead, I doubled down. I installed cameras, documented everything, reinforced my gravel system. I even regraded the edge of my backyard with a gentle slope leading to a dry well I built by hand. They called me paranoid, but I called it preparing, because the clouds were building both in the sky and in spirit. The summer heat grew heavier by the day, and the forecasts began whispering about tropical moisture, heading up from the Gulf. I watched the barometric pressure drop like a slow-sinking stone. And in my gut, I knew. When the rain came, it wouldn't be kind. I sent my final letter on a Thursday. It was 5 pages long, concise, respectful, but firm. I used diagrams references to state code and included direct citations from the county's 2003 flood mitigation report. I even printed the whole thing on high-quality ivory bond paper, hoping it would feel more like an official document than just a homeowner's plea. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office, slid it into the incoming mail slot myself. Then I waited. For 5 days, I heard nothing. Not an email, not a phone call, not even one of those cold-clipped notices they love to leave on people's porches. So on the 6th day, I walked back to the clubhouse. It was mid-morning and the front desk was empty. No one answered when I rang the bell, so I stepped around to the side office. The door was slightly ajar. I knocked once and pushed it open. Inside sat Daniel Thompson, vice president of the HOA, with his feet up on the desk and a smoothie in one hand. He was scrolling through his phone and barely looked up when I entered. "I left a letter here last week," I said. 5 pages. "Drainage assessment. Did it reach the board?" He shrugged. "Couldn't say. We get a lot of paper." I stood there waiting, watching his fingers flick across his screen like a bored teenager in a waiting room. Finally, I asked, "Do you mind if I check the incoming mail tray? It should be." He gestured lazily to the trash bin beside the desk. I didn't believe it at first, but I knelt down, and there it was. My letter. Folded, creased, and wedged between a Starbucks cup and a pizza coupon. The embossed page corners were still intact, but the pages had been crumpled as if someone had started to ball it up and then changed their mind halfway through. "You threw it away," I said. Daniel didn't even blink. It was a rant. We don't respond to rants. It was a report, I replied, heat rising in my chest, with evidence, with real risk assessments. "You're not just ignoring me anymore. You're endangering the neighborhood." He leaned forward, then dropping his feet to the floor with a loud thump. The smoothie hit the desk with a soft, wet slap. "You want to know what's dangerous," he said. "It's people like you. Obsessive, fixated, stirring up fear. Talking about sinkholes and invisible floods when the only thing flooding this HOA is your emails." I stared at him. For a moment I saw through the bravado, the fear flickering just beneath the arrogance. He didn't know what he was doing. Not really. And that terrified him. But he wasn't about to admit it. So I left. I didn't slam the door, didn't shout, didn't threaten legal action or post on the community app, though every cell in my body told me to. I simply walked home, opened my computer, and uploaded every file photo and report I had to the county database. They called it public concern submission. I called it insurance. The next week, I got a violation notice in the mail. This time, it claimed my downspouts were out of code too long, apparently. They cited a rarely enforced line in the HOA bylaws about visible drainage extensions, complete with a grainy photo taken from the sidewalk. They'd walked onto my property to photograph my gutter pipes. It was personal now. I appealed the violation in writing, citing the same bylaws, and noting how several other homes, including board members, had identical downspouts. The appeal was denied. Then they fined me. $200. I didn't pay it. Instead, I wrote a formal letter to the HOA's legal counsel. I reminded them of the protections outlined under the Texas Property Code section on 209 and attached a notarized copy of the submission I'd sent to the county. I stated in exact terms that any future fines would constitute retaliatory action and I would seek injunctive relief. I mailed it certified. A week passed, then 2. No more violations came, but the silence grew louder. Neighbors began to whisper. I could feel the unease. When I walked to the mailbox, mothers pulling their kids a little closer, joggers, turning down the next street. I was no longer just that guy with the clipboard. I was the pariah, the man poking the hornet's nest. And yet, in the quiet corners of the community, others reached out. A man from Ridgeview Court emailed me anonymously, saying he had similar pooling issues and was too afraid to speak up. A woman from Birch Lane left a voicemail thanking me for trying to protect what the rest of us take for granted. But no one would say it out loud. They'd seen what the board could do. I kept collecting evidence. I updated my maps. I reran my calculations every time it rained. The sinkage was accelerating ever so slightly. The ground, once spongy, had grown loose in places like soft bread underfoot. Then one morning I saw something that made my stomach turn. A new stack of bricks delivered to the park's edge. Concrete pavers. They were moving forward. I knew what that meant: more impermeable surface, less soil exposure, and the final nail in the coffin for the neighborhood's ability to drain stormwater safely. They were sealing their own fate, and they had no idea. Yet. It started on a Monday morning early. Before the sun had fully risen and while the birds were still shaking off the night, the rumble of diesel engines echoed down my street. I stood at my kitchen window sipping black coffee, watching 3 trucks pull up along the park perimeter. One carried pallets of pavers. Another hauled bags of crushed granite and cement mix. The third, a small backhoe. I didn't need to see the blueprints. I knew exactly what they were about to do. Karen had made her plans public at the last HOA newsletter, Park Revitalization Project, she called it. The glossy pamphlet featured renderings of neat stone walkways, flower beds shaped like stars, and a central plaza with benches arranged in perfect concentric circles. But what she never once mentioned, what she deliberately omitted, was that the entire western half of the park sat in the basin of an old seasonal creek bed. An area I'd proven again and again was already oversaturated and unstable. I walked outside, crossed the street, and approached the crew chief, a stocky guy, with a clipboard and a safety vest stained with concrete dust. "Hey," I said, "who pulled your permit for this?" He squinted at me. "We're under contract through the HOA. Everything's handled, sir. Was a geotechnical survey done before laying foundation?" He blinked. "We're just laying pavers, not pouring footers. Didn't need it." I felt my jaw clench. "Did they at least show you a stormwater management plan?" He looked back at the trucks. "Sir, I'm just here to build a walkway." Fair enough. I didn't blame him. I blamed the board. By noon, they had started compacting the soil with a vibratory roller. I could feel the tremors all the way from my porch. It was a sickening thud, thud, thud that pulsed through my chest like a war drum. Every pass packed the ground tighter, erasing the last bit of sponge-like resistance. They weren't just ignoring the drainage issue, they were actively sealing the earth shut. Concrete is a curse in flood-prone areas. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't drain. It just reflects. And when the rain comes, it acts like a mirror pushing water outward in every direction, except down. By evening, a portion of the western field was covered in crisp, orderly rectangles of red and gray stone, like a chessboard waiting for its players to step into place. They even brought in solar garden lights, cute decorative things shaped like hummingbirds, and planted them in the new flower beds. The visual contrast was jarring manicured aesthetics atop unstable ground. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk reviewing the original land survey from when the neighborhood was built in the 1990s. Back then, the park was classified as low-impact green space, designed to absorb runoff from the northern slope during heavy rain. It was never intended to be paved. The HOA had inherited that responsibility. But as leadership changed and residents grew less informed, the documents had been buried beneath parties' newsletters and yoga sessions. So I made copies. I printed every page of the floodplain overlay, highlighted drainage notes, and even pulled screenshots from FEMA's online maps. Our neighborhood wasn't in the official flood zone, but that was because the park used to serve as the buffer. They were now paving over the very thing keeping us safe. 2 days later, I returned to the worksite binder in hand. Karen was there in heels, no less, walking the new path with Daniel gesturing proudly at the progress. I walked up, calmly greeted the foreman, then stood directly in Karen's path. She stopped inches from me, her smile tight, and her eyes already narrowing. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "if you're here to enjoy the new walkway, we're thrilled." "No," I said. "I'm here to ask for the last time that you stop this project." She rolled her eyes. "You've made your feelings quite clear." The board voted the budget passed, and this improvement was overwhelmingly approved by our members. "I've spoken with 10 homeowners in the lower basin," I said. None of them were informed this area would lose its capacity for water absorption. Karen crossed her arms. "We included the renovation plans in the April newsletter, without the environmental context, without disclosing the risk of flooding." Daniel stepped beside her, smirking. "We're not going to play Chicken Little every time it rains, Bellamy. Maybe you should take up a hobby. Have you tried watercolor?" It was then I realized they didn't just disagree with me. They truly believed nothing would happen. The worst kind of arrogance, the kind backed by ignorance, wrapped in bureaucracy. So I walked away. But not before leaving a USB drive in Karen's mailbox that evening, containing every report photo and time-stamped observation I had. I titled the folder, "When Not If." Let the record show I tried. That week, I quietly installed a small berm along the edge of my backyard. Just a gentle mound of packed earth camouflaged with grass seed. I added a French drain behind my shed, connected it to a buried pipe leading to a dry well I'd built the year prior. I elevated the crawl space vents, sealed the bottom half of the garage door, and triple-checked my backup sump pump. I didn't wait for the storm, because I knew it was already on its way. When the world won't listen, you build in silence. That was a lesson I'd learned more than once in my life, first as a young engineer in Louisiana, reinforcing levees while politicians debated on TV, then again overseas building temporary bridges through monsoon-soaked terrain. The difference between survival and devastation often came down to preparation done in solitude. So I stopped trying to convince anyone, and I started building. First came the yard. I spent 3 weekends regrading the soil around my foundation, making sure the slope sent all water away from the structure. I didn't use machinery, just a long aluminum level, a rake, and quiet persistence. I moved earth in the early hours before the sun baked the ground, when the air still smelled faintly of dew and cut grass. I extended my downspouts, not out into the lawn, where they could draw complaints again, but underground into PVC pipes I trenched and buried myself. I directed them into a 50-gallon dry well lined with river rock and filter fabric hidden beneath my vegetable garden. No one knew. Next came the retaining wall behind my garage. The board had cited me for unauthorized changes when I first stacked 2 layers of concrete blocks years ago. I never argued, just removed them and filed it away. But now I poured a hidden French drain behind where the wall used to be. I kept it below grade, invisible, unless someone were to dig for it, and they wouldn't. Not unless they were looking for proof. I called it my ghost wall. I resealed the basement windows, cut and fit marine-grade plywood panels for each one, painted to match the siding. You wouldn't notice unless you looked closely, but they were drilled and ready to bolt in at a moment's notice. The sump pump came next. The original one was old, barely enough for moderate runoff, so I replaced it with a high-capacity dual pump system connected to a battery backup with a solar panel mounted discreetly behind the shed. I also added a simple water alarm to the lowest corner of the basement. It chirped softly the first time I tested it enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Then came the shed. I had a second sump pump, smaller but mobile, and I stored it in the back of the shed along with 3 heavy-duty extension cords, 5 sandbags, and a collapsible water barrier I'd ordered from a flood management company in Tulsa. It cost me more than I like to admit, but I considered it my version of flood insurance the HOA refused to understand. While others posted selfies on the new paver path, I was quietly installing flood vent covers. While kids played catch near the duck pond, I was tracing the lowest grade lines with a shovel, mapping where the water would go. It always goes somewhere. I kept a diary of each modification, labeled folders, dated everything. Not out of paranoia, but for my daughter. She was 25, living in Denver, too far to help, but worried enough to call every week. I told her the truth, but softened it. It's just some minor drainage prep, I'd say. "Dad, are you okay?" she'd ask. Always I'd reply, "This isn't the first flood I've met, and it wouldn't be the last." By late June, the sky had changed. The clouds started to carry weight. I could feel it in the air, the way the wind moved, the heaviness just beneath the surface of a sunny day. Then it happened. A tropical depression stalled in the Gulf, strengthened over 48 hours, and took an unusual curve north. The news stations didn't sound alarms at first. It was far enough away. But those of us who had seen the patterns, who knew what saturated soil and blocked runoff could do, understood this was different. I checked the models. I checked the barometric pressure. And I looked outside at the new pavers gleaming like glass across the park. It was too late to stop anything, but not too late to brace for it. So I sealed the crawl space vents, put the plywood up over the basement windows, prepped the second sump pump, and filled the 5 sandbags with dry play sand from the shed. I laid them flat across the lower back door, knowing they wouldn't stop a wall of water, but they'd buy me time. I even ran one last test. I filled the dry well with hose water and watched as it drained slowly, then completely, just as I designed. The system was working. The storm alert came that night. Not a full warning, but a watch, heavy rainfall expected over the next 48 hours with possible flash flooding in low-lying areas. The HOA, they sent out a cheerful newsletter titled, "Rain, Rain, Come and Play," with a cartoon of rubber boots and umbrellas. It suggested residents check your patio furniture and enjoy the cool weather while it lasts. No mention of the fact that the entire western side of the park, where the pavers now glistened, had zero drainage infrastructure left. No mention of the neighborhood's natural runoff path, now sealed shut with stone. No mention of risk. I walked the perimeter one last time that night, just after dusk. The crickets were loud. The air smelled of ozone and fresh mulch. Across the street, I saw Karen's lights glowing softly beside her home, 2 stories tall, freshly painted with flower boxes in every window. She never looked out. She never saw me standing there. And maybe that's the problem with people like her. They don't look until it's too late. The rain didn't start with thunder. It started with silence. That eerie kind of stillness that settles over the neighborhood right before the first drop falls. When the air feels thick, the birds go quiet, and even the trees seem to hold their breath. I stood on my porch that morning, coffee untouched, watching the clouds move in from the southwest, like a slow gray tide swallowing the sky. By noon, the first sheets of rain were already sweeping through. The drops were fat and heavy, the kind that bounce when they hit the pavement. I could see ripples forming across the new paver path in the park, puddles merging like ink spots on paper. By 1 o'clock, the street drains were already choking. Water gurgled from the grates, swirling with leaves and bits of mulch. It had nowhere to go. The park, which used to act like a sponge, now gleamed like glass, a perfect mirror reflecting the darkening sky above. I checked my gauges. Rainfall rate 2 inches per hour and climbing. The radar on my tablet showed a red streak cutting directly across our county. I knew that pattern. It wasn't a passing storm. It was a conveyor belt. By 3, the gutters on most houses were overflowing. By 4, the street looked like a river. I went outside in my rain jacket, hood drawn tight, and started my pump. The small hum of the motor was the only sound that felt sane in the chaos. The water collected in my back channel exactly as I'd predicted, flowing neatly into the trench and down the dry well. My system was holding, but across the street, chaos was blooming. The water from the park began spilling over the curb, sloshing into Karen's manicured yard. The decorative lights she'd installed started to blink erratically, their solar cells submerged beneath the rising sheet of brown water. I saw her through the window, pacing, phone pressed to her ear. I could almost hear her tone, commanding, impatient, trying to fix a force she didn't understand. The rain didn't care. At 5, the thunder arrived, low and constant, like the growl of something ancient awakening. The wind kicked up, driving the rain sideways, bending the trees until they hissed and creaked under pressure. My fence shuddered and the power flickered once, then twice. I checked the sump pump again, still running steady. The alarm light was green. My property remained dry, though the rest of the street shimmered under a thin film of standing water. I thought about calling some of the neighbors, maybe offering help, but part of me knew they wouldn't listen until they had to, so I waited. Then around 6:30, I heard the first scream. It came from down near Birch Lane, a high, sharp cry that cut through the roar of the rain. I ran to the front porch and saw headlights bouncing through the water. Someone's sedan was stuck halfway up the street, its tires spinning uselessly as the flood pushed against the frame. A man waded out waist deep, already trying to push, shouting for help. 2 more came from nearby porches, slipping and stumbling through the water. It was rising fast, faster than even I expected. That's when I realized the unthinkable. The park had turned into a reservoir, and it was overflowing. The paved surface was forcing every drop outward. The lowest homes, Karen's, Daniels, and 2 along the west corner, were now in the direct path of the spillover. The water gushed through their side yards, cascading like a miniature waterfall over driveways and flower beds. I ran for my toolkit, grabbed my flashlight, and slogged out into the storm. The noise was deafening, wind-water alarms going off from nearby garages. The smell of wet mulch and gasoline filled the air. I shouted to Daniel, who was standing knee-deep near his car, trying to pull open a clogged drain grate with his bare hands. "It's no use," I yelled. "The system's blocked, the runoff's coming from the park." He turned, eyes wide, rain streaking down his face. "What do we do?" he screamed. For a moment, I almost laughed, not out of joy but disbelief. The same man who'd called me paranoid was now looking at me like I was the last man left who knew what to do. "Sandbags," I shouted. "Get them up against your garage and back door now." He nodded, stumbling toward his porch. But it was already too late. The water breached his lawn, rushing into the first-floor vents. I could see it sloshing against his patio door, pushing inward, bending the frame. Across the way, Karen was on her porch, screaming into her phone, waving her arms as though the storm would obey. I waded through waist-deep water to the corner junction, where the original drainage pipe used to be. I could still remember the exact coordinates from the blueprints. I dug with my gloved hands, scraping mudgrass and broken bits of gravel until my fingers hit the smooth edge of sealed concrete. They'd filled it completely. The drain was gone. I sank to my knees in the cold water, rain pounding my back like fists. They had buried the one lifeline this land ever had. And now it was coming for them. By 8, the first transformers blew. The entire neighborhood fell into darkness, except for the pulsing blue flashes of lightning. The only light left came from my porch, the solar backup flickering weakly, but holding. My pumps were still humming, my yard still dry. But everywhere else, the neighborhood was drowning. Karen's voice rose again, through the storm, desperate cracking between sobs and fury. Daniel's car alarm wailed muffled under the water. And for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel anger. I felt something heavier, something closer to grief. Because I hadn't wanted to be right. Not like this. By midnight, the rain began to ease. The storm moved north, its tail still lashing us in waves, but the damage was done. The park had turned into a lake. Half the neighborhood was submerged. Emergency crews were already pushing through the main road, their flashing lights distorted through sheets of rain. I shut my pump off, looked at my dry floors, and sat down on the porch steps, soaked, shivering, and silent. The only sound left was the water, and it wasn't done yet. The morning after the storm, everything was still. Not peaceful, just still, like the world was holding its breath in the aftermath of something it couldn't yet comprehend. I woke just after dawn, not because of an alarm, but because of the silence. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy wet with grief. A dull gray sky blanketed the neighborhood, and the ground still shimmered, reflecting the light like a sea of melted glass. I opened the front door and stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into the edge of my grass, but only slightly. My yard was intact. The berm held. The dry well drained. The pumps did their job. It wasn't pristine, the flower beds were soggy, and the rain barrel overflowed sometime in the night, leaving a pool near the shed. But my foundation was dry. No water in the basement, no buckling in the floors, no hum of mildew rising from carpet or walls. I was lucky. No, that wasn't the word. I was prepared. But as I stepped out further into the street, the contrast was hard to stomach. Across the way, Karen's house was a disaster. Water had risen at least 2 feet up the siding, leaving behind a thick line of mud and debris, like a bruise on the face of her freshly painted facade. Her shutters hung crooked, one barely attached. The mulch beds she'd bragged about all spring had floated into the street, mingling with lawn chairs, plastic toys, and splintered pieces of fence. The pavers in the park were completely underwater. A perfect useless mosaic beneath a foot of brown still water. I heard voices. Karen was on her porch, wrapped in a bathrobe, hair soaked and clinging to her neck. Her eyes were red not from crying, but from something deeper. From disbelief. From loss. Beside her stood 2 police officers, one taking notes while the other pointed toward the submerged park. She wasn't yelling anymore. She was quiet now, speaking slowly, her arms gesturing at the water, as if explaining something she didn't understand herself. I walked farther down the street. Daniel's garage was wide open, soaked cardboard boxes spilling out into the driveway. His vintage Mustang, his pride and joy, sat in ankle-deep water, interior ruined, leather seats warped and bubbling under the weight of a flood they never imagined. Neighbors stood in clusters, some crying, others silent. One woman cradled a dog wrapped in a towel. Another sat on her porch steps, head in hands, shoulders trembling. The neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Only no bombs had dropped. No fire had spread. Just water. And water never comes in peace when it's been ignored. I passed one house where a couple was hauling rugs out the front door, dumping them in the yard like corpses. They glanced at me as I walked by. The woman said nothing, just nodded tight-lipped but not unkind. I nodded back. Then a voice called from behind me. "Your house is untouched." I turned. It was Daniel. He looked rough eyes, sunken hair matted from sweat and rain jeans, soaked to the thigh. He stood there beside his ruined garage, hands on his hips, like a man who had finally run out of excuses. "It is," I said simply. He stared at me for a long moment, then his shoulders sagged. "I should have listened," he muttered. "I didn't say I told you so. I didn't have to." Instead, I walked closer and said, "I've got a spare pump in my shed, and a dehumidifier if you need it." He blinked. "You'd still help me after everything." I didn't answer right away. I looked around at the neighborhood, at the water that still lingered, refusing to recede, clinging to the streets like regret. At the faces of people who once crossed the street to avoid me. At Karen now kneeling in her ruined flower beds, trying to salvage something, anything. "I didn't warn you out of spite," I said. "I warned you because it was the right thing to do. That hasn't changed." He nodded, his face tight with shame. I walked with him back toward his house and handed him the pump. showed him how to run the extension cords safely, where to angle the hose to push water downhill. By noon, I'd helped 4 other families. No one asked why I did it. They all knew. They just couldn't look me in the eye when they said thank you. That evening, as the sun broke through for the first time in days, I stood on my back deck and surveyed the scene. The park was a lake. The path was gone. The solar lights had drifted toward the eastern end, clustered like survivors on a raft. But my yard, green, quiet, dry. My daughter called. "Dad, I saw the storm on the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "We took a hit, but I was ready." There was a pause on the line. Then her voice softened. "Did they finally believe you?" I looked across the street at Karen's porch, now empty. At the dumpster, someone had rolled into Daniel's driveway. At the wreckage left behind by ignorance and pride. "Yeah," I said, "they believe me now." The real tragedy wasn't that they didn't listen. It was that they had the chance to multiple times and chose not to. It wasn't just water that destroyed this neighborhood. It was arrogance and denial. But now that the storm had passed, maybe there was a chance to rebuild something better. Not just homes, but trust and truth. It started with a knock. Not the kind of aggressive pounding I'd come to expect from HOA notices or code enforcement, just a soft, rapid rhythm at my front door. I opened it to find Marlene Foster, one of the loudest voices at every board meeting. She was always the first to vote aye when Karen proposed anything, and the first to glare when I stood up with my maps. Now she stood in my doorway, drenched to the skin, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, hair matted to her scalp. Her voice trembled. "Please," she said, "my basement's flooding. The water, it's almost to the fuse box. We don't know what to do." I didn't move at first. Not out of cruelty, but shock. It had been less than 24 hours since the storm receded. Less than 1 full day since these same people had scoffed at my warnings, mocked my diagrams, and written me off as some retired lunatic with too much time on his hands. And now they were here. I grabbed my tool bag, a pair of waterproof boots, and a small pump from the shed. When I arrived at Marlene's house, the situation was worse than she let on. The water had already surged past the basement windows and filled the lower level like a bowl. Electrical sockets hissed and sparked, and the air was thick with that sickly smell of soaked drywall and mildew already forming. Her husband, Greg, stood on the stairs holding a flashlight, his face pale. I could tell he was scared not just for their house, but for what it meant, for how utterly helpless he felt. "Where's your main panel?" I asked. "In the laundry room. He hesitated. "It's under." I cursed under my breath. I gave them instructions: shut off the breaker at the main outdoor feed, don't touch anything inside. I set up the pump by the basement hatch that led outside, using the angle of the slope to start pulling water out. It would take hours, but it was better than nothing. Then I left them with towels, a mop, and a grim look. "I'll check back in an hour." They nodded, hollow-eyed, ashamed. By the time I got home, 2 more people had come to my porch. One was Todd, the guy who used to joke about me retiring too hard. His garage had collapsed when the waterlogged beams gave way. He was soaked, shivering, holding what looked like a moldy bundle of clothes. The other was Mrs. Nguyen, the quiet widow who lived 3 doors down. Her crawl space had flooded completely. She spoke so softly I had to kneel to hear her through the wind. "Can you help?" she whispered. "I don't know who else to ask." I worked the rest of the day without food. My shirt clung to my back with sweat, and rain my knees ached from crouching and my hands shook with exhaustion. But I didn't stop. Not even when my phone buzzed with calls from unfamiliar numbers. Word had gotten around. They all came, one by one. The very people who'd laughed at me. Daniel arrived just before sunset, soaking wet, carrying a soggy HOA binder in a plastic bag. He started, then stopped. "Spit it out," I said, though I already knew what was coming. He swallowed. "We're overwhelmed. Half the board's homes are unlivable. Karen's, she had to leave. Her whole first floor's gone. And the city's breathing down our necks." I crossed my arms. "You need my help." He nodded. "We need your knowledge. Please, we need a mitigation plan. We need to know how to recover, where to start." There was a moment, just a breath, when I considered saying no. Let them sit in the mess they made. Let them learn. But that wasn't who I was. So I walked inside, grabbed my folder marked after, and handed it to him. It contained recovery steps, how to apply for county aid, how to log damage for FEMA, how to dry structural framing, how to disinfect waterlogged materials. All of it. Everything I'd prepped weeks before the storm. He stared at the folder like it was a blueprint to salvation. "It's all in there," I said. "But I won't do the work for you." He nodded slowly. "Understood." As he turned to go, I added, "You'll need to report the sealed drain to the city engineer. They'll want to know why it failed." He froze. I could see the shame bloom on his face like a bruise. "They didn't even know it was filled in," I continued. "You'll have to explain why the HOA didn't report that modification, and who authorized it." He didn't reply. Didn't have to. We both knew who did. By nightfall, I was sitting on my porch again, head pounding, fingers numb from the cold steel of tools I hadn't put down all day. And that's when Karen showed up. Her car pulled up slowly, splashing through puddles like a ghost ship adrift in a sea of wreckage. She stepped out in a long coat, her hair pulled back tightly, no makeup, no clipboard, no entourage, just her. She walked up the steps and stood in silence. "Your house looks good," she said finally. I said nothing. She looked at me, really looked this time, not like a threat or an obstacle, but like a man she'd finally recognized. "I didn't believe you," she said. "Not because I thought you were wrong, but because I thought I had to be right." I let out a long breath, the kind you don't realize you've been holding. She looked down. "I'm sorry." The words hung there awkward and late, but real. I didn't forgive her, not yet. But I nodded. A small one. The kind of nod that says, maybe not today, but maybe someday. Then she turned and walked back to her car, disappeared into the stillness. Behind me, the house hummed, with steady pumps and dry circuits. Ahead of me, the street sparkled with broken things and dirty water, but also perhaps with the beginning of change. It didn't take long for the city to get involved. 3 days after the storm, a white pickup with the seal of the Department of Public Works rolled down our street. A man in muddy boots and a neon vest stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the damage with quiet intensity. He wasn't here for photo ops. He was here to account. Behind him, another vehicle pulled up, this one marked County Environmental Oversight. Then a third, Infrastructure Safety Division. Within hours, the neighborhood was crawling with officials. They measured flood lines against house sidings, took photos of the submerged park, jotted notes at each clogged drain. A few of them knocked on doors, politely asking questions. Others wandered freely, mapping flow patterns, identifying erosion points, marking out subsurface failures with orange spray paint and utility flags. I watched it all from my porch, silent, sipping weak coffee. By midday, one of them approached me. He was older, maybe late 50s, with salt and pepper stubble, and sharp eyes that looked like they'd seen too many of these situations before. "You Mr. Bellamy?" "I am." He extended a gloved hand. "Jake Morales, civil engineering consultant for the county. Heard you tried to warn the HOA." I gave a small shrug. I did what I could. He nodded, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "We received your submission. Impressive detail. You worked in infrastructure. Army Corps of Engineers. Retired." He whistled low. "Explains the diagrams. We've reviewed your files, including the FEMA overlays and the pre-storm runoff maps. There's something we need you to see." I followed him down to the park, what used to be the park. Now it looked more like a shallow marsh. Water still lingered warm and murky, with bits of floating debris and drowned grass clinging to the surface. Jake pointed toward a concrete patch where the ground had cracked open. This here was the original primary drain point for the lower basin. The stormwater used to exit the neighborhood through a sloped pipe feeding into the municipal system half a mile downhill. I nodded. That's what I told them. They paved over it, sealed it completely. He looked at me grimly. Not just sealed. They packed the interior with cement fill. That's a Class C violation of municipal code. You can't touch storm infrastructure without county coordination. And they never filed a single permit. I felt a strange combination of vindication and dread settle in my chest. Jake pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, kneeling to shine it inside the broken slab. Water pressure blew it back open. "That's what you're seeing here." The internal pressure built up behind the blockage until it burst, and when it did, it channeled straight toward the homes in the basin. "Karen's house," I said softly. He nodded, and Daniel's, and Marlene's, and about 6 others, all in the natural runoff path. He stood dusted off his knees. "I've filed for an emergency assessment. The HOA board's looking at fines likely upwards of $75,000. Possibly more if any resident files civil claims." I blinked. 75,000. He raised an eyebrow. "They tampered with public drainage infrastructure. That's not just HOA negligence. That's endangerment. And we're hearing from the fire marshal now, too. There were delays in emergency response due to blocked street access. I swallowed. He looked at me again. You ever consider running for the board? I chuckled quietly, bitterly. Not in a million years. Maybe you should. Someone like you could have stopped this. I shook my head. Someone like me tried. He nodded, understanding. The news of the investigation spread through the neighborhood faster than any storm ever could. Karen's name was on every lip. Whispers about her stepping down turned to confirmations by day's end. An emergency board meeting was scheduled, mandatory attendance, first time in years. I went, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. The air was tense, the floor still faintly damp from the flood cleanup. Daniel stood behind the folding table, tie askew, voice shaking as he addressed the room. Due to findings from the city engineer and public works department, the HOA board formally accepts responsibility for unauthorized alterations to public drainage infrastructure. We acknowledge this led to preventable property damage, and we are cooperating fully with the investigation. He looked directly at me once as he said it. No smirk, no smugness, just shame. Karen wasn't there. She had officially resigned that morning, a quiet email sent to the HOA inbox at 5:47 a.m. No apology, no statement, just 3 words, I hereby resign. But her absence was louder than any apology could have been. The board voted to dissolve the Park Improvement Committee. The pavers were to be torn up and removed. The area would be restored to native soil and left open to absorb runoff once more. They even proposed a motion to create a new flood response and prevention advisory role. They asked me to fill it. I declined. I told them I'd be happy to provide guidance, but I wasn't going to wear a title that should have been offered months ago. Not after the damage was done. I would help as a neighbor. That was enough. As the meeting ended, people came up to shake my hand. Some thanked me in whispers. Others offered help fixing fences, clearing debris, or repairing tools I'd lent out during the cleanup. There were no more smirks, no sideways glances, just quiet respect. As I walked home, the clouds began to part. The sunset broke through in streaks of gold and soft orange, reflecting off the last puddles in the street. A breeze carried the scent of wet earth and hope. Justice didn't always come in loud declarations or sweeping punishments. Sometimes it came quietly, in citations issued by city officials, in resignations typed at dawn, and in the hushed gratitude of people who finally saw what they'd chosen not to before. I unlocked my door, stepped into my dry home, and exhaled. Not with triumph, but with relief. Summer turned to fall with unusual quiet. The birds came back, first blue jays and finches, picking through what remained of shattered flower beds and drowned shrubs. Then the trees recovered, shaking off the flood like a bad memory, their roots somehow holding firm in the soaked earth. But the people, many didn't return. Karen's house sat dark for weeks before a for sale sign finally appeared, tilted awkwardly in her yard like a flag raised in surrender. Word was she moved to Arizona, closer to her sister. I doubted she told many goodbye. Daniel left shortly after. His Mustang was towed, ruined beyond restoration. The last time I saw him, he was loading boxes into a U-Haul, the HOA binder conspicuously absent from his belongings. Others followed. 4 houses went on the market by the end of October. 2 sold fast to buyers who hadn't lived through the storm, who didn't know what had happened, who saw only price cuts and fresh paint. But I stayed. Not because I had nowhere else to go. My daughter begged me to move to Denver, to come stay with her for the winter, maybe forever. But something held me here, not pride, not stubbornness, but something quieter, something heavier. I'd watched this neighborhood rise and fall. I'd warned them, watched them scoff, and watched nature answer with a force no board meeting could contain. Leaving now would have felt like walking away from a story still being written. So I stayed. And slowly the neighborhood began to breathe again. The city came through in November with a flood mitigation team. They brought in heavy equipment, removed the ruined pavers from the park, and excavated the old drain line. I stood at the edge of the site the morning they dug it up, watched as the bucket clawed into the ground and unearthed the cement plug like a tombstone. The lead technician, a tall woman in a reflective vest, saw me watching. She nodded. "You were right," she said simply. "I usually wish I wasn't," I replied. They didn't just clear the line, they expanded it, installed 2 additional runoff channels, redirected the slope of the park, planted native grasses with deeper root systems. For the first time in years, water had somewhere to go. And still, no one from the old board reached out. But the new board, they were different. Marlene surprised me. She stepped up after the storm quietly, but deliberately. She no longer spoke in clipped tones or waved away reports. She attended every city meeting, took detailed notes, and knocked on doors herself to check in with the elderly residents who had been overlooked for years. One afternoon, she brought me a pie. It was store-bought, but she handed it over like it was sacred. "I know it doesn't fix anything," she said, "but I'm trying to do better." "That's all any of us can do," I replied. And we did. The neighborhood changed not just in landscaping, but in tone. People waved again. They asked questions. They listened. The clubhouse hosted meetings where the word drainage wasn't met with eye rolls, but with nods and real discussion. I wasn't a hero, but I wasn't a pariah anymore either. One crisp December morning, I walked the edge of the park. Dew clung to the grass, and the air carried that faint metallic smell of frost. The ground where the pavers used to be was soft again, rich with mulch and promise. A new sign stood at the trailhead, small and tasteful. Bellamy Basin Community Green Space and Runoff Zone. I stared at it for a long time. Someone had painted it by hand. No ceremony, no plaque. Just a quiet acknowledgement in brushstrokes. I didn't cry, but something in me loosened. A knot I didn't know I'd been carrying for years. My phone buzzed, a text from my daughter. "Thinking of you today. Proud of you, Dad." I stared at the message, thumbs hovering, then replied, "It finally feels like home again." Because it did. Not because the houses were whole, not all of them were. Not because the HOA was perfect, it never would be. But because finally, people had learned to listen. To the ground. To each other. To truth. And maybe that's how healing begins, not with an apology or even justice, but with quiet change, steady hands, and the kind of resilience that doesn't need recognition. The flood didn't break me. It revealed what was already broken. And then it gave us all a second chance. I stayed. And this time they listened.